What if I told you that everything you think you know about leadership, morality, and power is wrong? What if the most effective leaders throughout history have operated by a completely different set of rules than what society teaches us? In 1513, a disgraced Italian diplomat named Niccolò Machiavelli wrote a book that would shock the world and change how we understand power forever. The Prince wasn't just a political treatise. It was a psychological manual for understanding human nature at its most raw and unfiltered level. For over 500 years, Machiavelli's name has been synonymous with cunning, manipulation, and ruthless pragmatism. But here's what most people miss. Machiavelli wasn't teaching people to be evil. He was revealing truths about power and human psychology that most of us prefer to ignore. Today I'm going to take you inside the mind of history's most controversial political theorist and show you why his insights about fear, trust, and control are more relevant now than ever. We'll explore the psychological principles that make his advice so effective, examine why his ideas were revolutionary in the 16th century, and understand how they still shape politics, business, and human relationships today. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Machiavelli's brutal honesty about human nature might be the most practical wisdom you'll ever encounter, even if it challenges everything you want to believe about how the world works. Before we dive into Machiavelli's psychology, we need to understand the world that created him. Italy in the early 1500s was a chaotic mess of competing city-states, foreign invasions, and political instability. Machiavelli had witnessed firsthand how noble ideals and moral leadership often led to disaster, while cunning and pragmatic rulers managed to survive and protect their people. He had served the Florentine Republic for 14 years, watching idealistic leaders make decisions based on how they thought the world should work rather than how it actually worked. When the Medici family returned to power, Machiavelli was imprisoned, tortured, and exiled from political life. It was during this exile that he wrote The Prince, not as an abstract philosophical exercise, but as a practical guide based on years of observing what actually worked in the real world versus what moral philosophy said should work. This context is crucial because Machiavelli wasn't advocating for cruelty or deception because he enjoyed them. He was trying to solve a fundamental problem. How do you maintain stability and protect your people in a world where your enemies don't follow moral rules? His answer was shocking. You must be willing to abandon traditional morality when survival is at stake. This wasn't nihilism or evil. It was radical pragmatism born from watching too many good people lose to bad people who understood power better. Now let's examine Machiavelli's core psychological insights, starting with his most famous and misunderstood principle. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Most people interpret this as advocacy for tyranny, but Machiavelli's reasoning was far more sophisticated. He observed that love is unreliable because it depends on the other person's feelings, which can change based on circumstances, emotions, or self-interest. Fear, however, is based on consistent consequences, making it more predictable and controllable. But here's the crucial part that people miss. Machiavelli explicitly warned against being hated. He distinguished between fear and hatred, arguing that effective leaders inspire respect and caution without crossing into cruelty that breeds resentment and rebellion. The psychology behind this principle is profound. Fear creates behavioral compliance through the anticipation of negative consequences. Love creates compliance through positive emotion, but emotions are volatile and situation-dependent. A leader who relies solely on being loved becomes vulnerable whenever their followers' interests diverge from their own. Think about effective leaders you've known. The most successful ones probably combined elements of both. They were respected and maybe even loved, but there was also a clear understanding that crossing them would have consequences. They didn't rule through terror, but they also didn't rely solely on being liked. Machiavelli's second major insight was about the nature of human motivation. He argued that people are fundamentally driven by self-interest, and that effective leadership requires understanding and working with this reality rather than hoping people will transcend it. This wasn't cynicism, it was psychological realism. Machiavelli observed that people make decisions based on what benefits them, protects them, or advances their interests. Leaders who failed to account for this ended up disappointed when their followers abandoned them for better opportunities or safer positions. But Machiavelli also understood that self-interest could be aligned with collective good through intelligent leadership. The key was creating systems where doing the right thing was also the beneficial thing for individuals. Instead of relying on people's virtue, create incentives that make virtuous behavior advantageous. This principle appears everywhere in modern life. Successful businesses don't rely on employees being naturally motivated. They create incentive structures that align individual success with company success. Effective governments don't depend on citizens being naturally law-abiding. They create legal systems where following the law is easier and more beneficial than breaking it. Machiavelli's third crucial insight was about the strategic use of deception. He argued that while honesty is generally preferable, leaders must be prepared to deceive when necessary for the greater good. But he emphasized that deception should be used sparingly, strategically, and always in service of larger objectives. The psychology here is complex. Machiavelli understood that complete honesty can sometimes harm the very people you're trying to protect. Sometimes leaders need to conceal information to prevent panic, misrepresent their capabilities to deter enemies, or make promises they're not certain they can keep in order to maintain morale during difficult times. But he also warned that habitual lying destroys credibility and trust. The most effective approach was to be generally truthful or reserving deception for situations where it serves a vital purpose. This maintains overall credibility while preserving the option for strategic misdirection when necessary. Modern leadership research has validated this insight. Studies show that leaders who never lie are often less effective than those who occasionally engage in prosocial lying, deception intended to benefit others. The key is that such deception must be rare, strategic, and genuinely motivated by collective rather than personal interest. Machiavelli's fourth principle involved understanding the psychology of perception versus reality. He argued that in leadership, appearance often matters more than substance, and that effective leaders must manage both what they do and how they're perceived doing it. This wasn't advocacy for being fake or manipulative. It was recognition that people make decisions based on their perceptions of reality, not reality itself. A leader might be competent, honest, and well-intentioned, but if they're perceived as weak, indecisive, or untrustworthy, their ability to lead effectively is compromised regardless of their actual qualities. Machiavelli therefore emphasized the importance of cultivating the right image while also developing the substance to back it up. He advised leaders to appear merciful, faithful, humane, honest, and religious, while actually being prepared to act contrary to these virtues when circumstances demanded it. The psychological sophistication of this approach is remarkable. Machiavelli understood that leadership is fundamentally about influence, and influence depends on how others perceive you. Managing perception isn't manipulation. It's communication strategy designed to maximize your ability to achieve beneficial outcomes. Think about how this applies in modern contexts. Politicians who ignore public perception, regardless of their policy competence, often fail to implement good ideas because they can't build the coalition necessary for change. Business leaders who focus only on results without considering how their methods are perceived may achieve short-term success but create long-term problems with employee morale and public reputation. Machiavelli's fifth insight was about the timing and application of force. He argued that when force becomes necessary, it should be applied swiftly, decisively, and comprehensively rather than gradually or partially. The psychology behind this principle is that gradual application of force creates prolonged suffering and ongoing resistance, while decisive action, though initially more harsh, ultimately causes less total harm and more quickly establishes new stability. He used the metaphor of a doctor treating illness. It's better to apply painful but effective treatment quickly than to use gentle methods that prolong suffering without solving the underlying problem. In leadership terms, this means that difficult decisions should be made and implemented rapidly rather than being drawn out over time. This principle appears in various modern contexts. In business, leaders often find that prolonged layoffs cause more organizational damage than quick, comprehensive restructuring. In personal relationships, avoiding difficult conversations to spare someone's feelings often causes more pain than having honest but uncomfortable discussions immediately. Now let's examine why Machiavelli's ideas were so shocking in his time and why they remain controversial today. In the 16th century, political theory was dominated by idealistic visions of how leaders should behave based on Christian virtue and classical philosophy. Leaders were supposed to be moral exemplars who governed through wisdom, justice, and benevolence. Machiavelli shattered this idealistic framework by focusing on effectiveness rather than virtue. He asked not, how should leaders behave according to moral philosophy, but what actually works in the real world of competing interests and limited resources. This shift from normative to descriptive analysis was revolutionary. Instead of telling leaders how they ought to behave, Machiavelli analyzed how successful leaders actually did behave. He studied history's most effective rulers, including those who employed methods that violated conventional morality, and extracted practical principles from their successes and failures. The controversy wasn't just about endorsing deception or force. It was about suggesting that traditional moral categories might be inadequate for understanding the complexities of leadership and power. Machiavelli implied that the world was more morally ambiguous than philosophers wanted to admit. This remains controversial today because we still want to believe that good intentions and moral behavior naturally lead to good outcomes. Machiavelli's insights suggest that sometimes they don't, and that effective leadership might require making choices that don't fit neatly into conventional moral frameworks. But here's what critics often miss. Machiavelli wasn't abandoning morality entirely. He was arguing for a more sophisticated moral framework that considered consequences alongside intentions. Sometimes protecting people requires doing things that seem cruel in isolation, but prevent greater cruelty in the long term. So how do Machiavelli's insights apply to modern life? His principles show up everywhere once you start looking for them. In business, successful leaders often embody Machiavellian insights. They maintain friendly relationships while being prepared to make tough personnel decisions. They manage their reputation carefully while focusing primarily on results. They tell employees what they need to hear to maintain morale while privately planning for multiple contingencies. In politics, Machiavellian principles are visible in how effective politicians build coalitions, manage public perception, and navigate competing interests. They maintain idealistic public messaging while engaging in pragmatic behind-the-scenes negotiations. They project strength while privately being flexible about methods and compromises. In personal relationships, Machiavellian insights help explain why some people are more influential and effective than others. Those who understand how to balance honesty with tact, who can inspire both affection and respect, and who know when to be flexible versus when to be firm, tend to achieve better outcomes in their personal and professional relationships. But applying Machiavellian principles ethically requires understanding their purpose. Machiavelli's advice wasn't meant to help people gain power for its own sake. It was meant to help leaders be more effective at protecting and serving their people. The key ethical question isn't whether you use Machiavellian tactics, but why you use them. Are you seeking power to benefit yourself or to achieve outcomes that serve others? Are you being strategic about methods while remaining committed to beneficial goals? This distinction matters because Machiavelli's principles can be used for good or evil depending on the leader's ultimate objectives. The tactics themselves are morally neutral tools. Their ethical value depends on how and why they're employed. Machiavelli's greatest insight might be that effective leadership requires accepting the world as it is, rather than as we wish it were. This doesn't mean abandoning ideals or moral principles. It means being strategic about how you pursue those ideals in a complex world, where your enemies may not share your moral constraints. Understanding Machiavellian psychology doesn't make you manipulative or immoral. It makes you more realistic about human nature, more effective at achieving beneficial outcomes, and better equipped to recognize when others are using these principles against you. The Prince's psychology reveals uncomfortable truths about power, influence, and human motivation. But understanding these truths, even when they challenge our preferred beliefs about how people should behave, is essential for anyone who wants to be effective in a world where good intentions alone aren't enough. Machiavelli's legacy isn't about teaching people to be cruel or deceptive. It's about providing the psychological tools necessary to navigate complex situations where traditional moral guidance offers insufficient practical direction. His insights remain relevant because human nature hasn't fundamentally changed in 500 years. The question isn't whether you'll encounter situations that require Machiavellian thinking. You will. The question is whether you'll understand these dynamics well enough to handle them effectively and ethically when they arise. What's one situation in your life where you've had to choose between being idealistic and being effective? How do you balance moral principles with practical necessities? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this exploration of Machiavellian psychology changed how you think about leadership and power, subscribe for more insights into the darker aspects of human nature and practical wisdom.